Hello everyone, in this video we'll be covering Chapter 12, Aggregate Expenditure and Output in the Short Run. In this chapter we'll be introducing a mathematical model of the economy known as the Aggregate Expenditure Model. This model focuses on the short-run relationship between total spending and real GDP. We're going to assume that price level is constant. We talked about the business cycle back in chapter 10, and when we will be discussing this model, we want to remember that the business cycle shows the interaction of many different economic variables. So we have identified the level of real GDP as mainly determined by the level of aggregate expenditure. Aggregate expenditure is just a fancy way of saying total spending in the economy. AE is what I'll refer to aggregate expenditure as, and it is total spending in the economy. Aggregate expenditure is also equal to 4 components, C plus I plus G plus NX. These might be familiar components we talked about when we introduced real GDP. The economist that identified these 4 components was John Maynard Keynes. He is the founder of what's called Keynesian economics, and these 4 components relate to the components of GDP we talked about earlier. Again, we have consumption here, investment, but here we have planned investment as I, government purchases as G, and net exports as NX. Remember, net exports is value of exports minus the value of imports. Aggregate expenditure is the sum of these 4 components. So, one thing you will notice right off the bat is the aggregate expenditure model uses planned investment rather than actual investment. It's different from GDP in this way. The difference is that planned investment does not include inventories that have been built up. These are goods that have been produced but not been sold. So planned investment equals actual investment minus unplanned change in inventories. The Bureau of Economic Analysis measures actual investment, but we're going to assume in this model that actual is close enough to planned in order to use it in our estimates of aggregate expenditure. So when we talk about unplanned changes in inventories, if the economy doesn't experience any unplanned changes, then actual investment will equal planned investment. If there is an increase in unplanned inventories, actual investment will be greater than planned investment. And if there's a decrease in unplanned inventories, actual investment will be less than planned investment. Okay. So now let's talk about macroeconomic equilibrium. Equilibrium occurs when output is equal to output produced, or when spending on output is equal to when the value of output produced. That's where GDP equals aggregate expenditure. This seems obvious, right? C plus I plus G plus NX equals C plus I plus G equals NX. The only difference is planned investment versus actual investment. So macroeconomic equilibrium is going to occur when planned investment equals actual investment. There's no unplanned changes in inventories. We will illustrate this on a graph in a little bit if you're not quite getting it. So let's kind of see what happens when one is greater than the other, when we're not at macroeconomic equilibrium. So when aggregate expenditure is greater than GDP, inventories are going to decline, and GDP and employment will increase. When aggregate expenditure is less than GDP, inventories increase, and GDP and employment will decrease. Remember, GDP is total spending and aggregate expenditure. GDP is total production and aggregate expenditure is total spending. Okay, so let's talk about how we determine the level of AE in the economy. AE is made up of different components within each specific component we already identified. So there are subcategories within consumption, investment, government expenditures, etc. So let's talk about the determinants of consumption. So to determine consumption, we will look at current disposable income, household wealth, expected future income, price level, and interest rate. Current disposable income, this was introduced earlier in Unit 1, I believe, when we talked about, or it could have been actually earlier this unit, we talked about different ways to measure output in the economy. Current disposable income is personal income minus personal income taxes plus transfer payments. It is essentially determined by how much money consumers receive within a given year. Then we saw household wealth. That equals assets minus liabilities. So your home and your bank account and your stocks and bonds, any investments you have, minus any loans you have, mortgages, etc. Then we have expected future income. People tend to keep consumption fairly stable from year to year. This is known as consumption smoothing. So consumption relates to both current and future income. So as we look at current income, it kind of explains current consumption when they're not extremes compared to future income. When we talk about price level, as price level rises, consumption will typically fall. And then finally, interest rates. Higher real interest rates, remember that's the cost of borrowing. As the cost of borrowing increases, then savings will be more attractive. Savings will increase, spending will decrease, and so consumption will fall, specifically on durable goods. When we talk about durable goods that require you to take out a loan potentially, automobiles, for example, maybe new appliances, those things. Remember, durable goods are those that last longer than 3 years. And consumption is the largest component of aggregate expenditure. So before we go on, I just want to expand a little bit about consumption and durable goods. Keep in mind, durable goods are going to be long-lived. when household incomes decline, it's easy to postpone buying these types of goods. Substitutes also exist. Rather than buying a new car, you might consider buying a used car. Also, the high prices of these goods make them riskier purchases. In times of uncertainty, consumers do factor in whether or not they'll be able to pay back a loan, and this is an important part of the decision-making process for consumers when they think about spending on durable goods. Another thing is during recessions, purchases of durable goods will typically be postponed, and then eventually after a recession begins to wind down, that demand increases. Finally, as interest rates fluctuate, you will also see changes in the consumption of those goods. We talked about that just a little bit when we talked about the interest rate. Okay, the consumption function, it shows the relationship between consumption spending and disposable income. We can see that as real disposable income increases, real consumption spending will also increase. This makes logical sense as well. And if we graph that out, we can see a linear type of pattern. This is illustrated in slide 17 of the PowerPoints. And so we can see that consumers have a relatively constant MPC, marginal propensity to consume. This is the amount by which consumption spending changes when disposable income changes, the slope of the consumption function. So we can estimate MPC by estimating the slope, which is the change in consumption over the change in disposable income. And we will use YD as the change in disposable income. So conversely, while we also have marginal propensity to consume, we also have marginal propensity to save. This is the amount by which saving changes when disposable income changes. So we can rewrite the equations to calculate how much a group is saving versus spending, and we end up seeing that MPC plus MPS equals 1. So our marginal propensity to consume plus our marginal propensity to save equals 1. Part of any increase in income is going to be consumed, and the rest is going to be saved. So if I said MPC equals 0.6, MPS, how would you get that? You would take 1 minus 0.6, and you would find that it's 0.4. I'm not going to ask you to model how the income, consumption, and savings is converted into this specific equation, 1 equals MPC plus MPS. Okay, so now that we've talked about consumption, let's move on and talk a little bit about planned investment. What affects the level of investment? We have expectations of future profitability, interest rate, taxes, and cash flow. Future profitability expectations. Remember, investment goods include factories, office buildings, machine equipment, technology, etc. They are typically long-lived. And when a company is more optimistic about the future, they will tend to consume, that's not the right word. They will decide to invest in more investment goods. So they'll build more factories, office buildings, and machines. New housing is also included in investment. For example, right now, a lot of the people receiving stimulus checks are investing in real estate and housing. Some people are choosing to build new houses, especially in the Amarillo Canyon area. And so we've kind of seen an increase in investment in this area. Interest rate. Business investment is oftentimes financed by borrowing. High interest rates would result in less investment spending. Lower interest rates result in more investment spending. Again, in the area, a lot of people are buying homes and building homes, although buying a home that's not new is not included in planned investment. Those who are building homes are doing so in a low interest rate environment. Taxes. Corporate taxes on profits will decrease in money available for reinvestment and decrease incentives to invest by diminishing expected profitability. Tax incentives tend to increase investment. Finally, cash flow. Investments are also paid for out of cash flow, which is the difference between revenues and spending, revenues and expenses. The largest contributor to cash flow is going to be profit. So during a recession, you won't see as many firms doing investment spending because they have a limited cash flow available. And then I didn't talk about government purchases here, but government purchases, similar to GDP, include all levels of government, federal, state, and local. They don't include transfer payments, only purchases for which the government receives some good or services. They have been generally, though not consistently, increasing over time. There have been a few exceptions in the early 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, and after the recession in 2007 to 2009. And then as far as net exports, you can see slide 27 has, it's actually not slide 27 in this new, it's slide 30 actually. And we can see that if price level, growth rate, and exchange rate changes, U.S. exports, net exports will be affected. This isn't an international economics course, so I'm not asking you to have a deep understanding of this, but just to understand that as the price level in the U.S. relative to other countries rises, net exports will decrease. If U.S. GDP is growing faster than foreign GDP, net exports will decrease. And if the U.S. dollar appreciates in value, net exports will decrease. It's because, respectively, if price levels are rising faster in the U.S., our goods are more expensive than foreign goods. So no one's going to want to buy things from us. If our GDP is growing faster, then U.S. demand for imports is rising faster than foreign demand for exports. And then if our dollar is appreciating in value, relatively imports are cheaper our exports are more expensive, and so imports rise, exports fall. I know that was a lot. Reference slide 30 if you are confused about how U.S. price level GDP and dollar value affects net exports. Okay. So that kind of wraps up talking about each component specifically. Now we're going to talk about graphing macroeconomic equilibrium. So there's a lot going on this page, but we'll kind of walk through it together. I do want you to remember that y equals c plus I plus g plus nx. Remember, that's GDP, that's output, and aggregate expenditure equals c plus I, planned investment, plus g plus nx. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the Keynesian cross model. This is using a 45-degree line to illustrate essentially real GDP versus real aggregate expenditure. AE is on the y-axis, GDP is on the x-axis. The 45-degree line is where y equals AE, where GDP equals aggregate expenditure. So anywhere on the 45-degree line, it's going to be macroeconomic equilibrium. And then we have our aggregate expenditure line, which is made up of consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. So here we're just showing aggregate expenditure line, but we could graph in each line respectively. So if I were to put this as the consumption line, C, then I could put this as I, and then I could put this as G, and then I could put this as NX, and then they would all add up to equal aggregate expenditure. So I'm not going to have those on there because it's going to be too cluttered, but I just want you to understand that the aggregate expenditure line here is made up of all of these other separate different consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net export lines. So if there's no other expenditures in the economy besides our C plus I plus G plus NX, our macroeconomic equilibrium is going to be equal to where the aggregate expenditure line crosses the 45-degree line. So that would be at 3. I've illustrated that in green. So point 3 is where we have aggregate expenditure equals to the 45-degree line. So aggregate expenditure equals GDP. So planned expenditures equal total production. Remember, total production is GDP. Okay, so what happens when we are not at the point where AE equals GDP? What happens if we are at point 1? There's been an unplanned decrease in inventories. So now if we're at point 1, what do we see happening? We are at a point where aggregate expenditure is greater than our 45-degree line. So we're in a recession. Planned expenditures are going to be greater than total production. Okay, so all of a sudden, inventory is starting to stack up. People aren't buying as many things. Our planned expenditure is greater than our total production here. Okay, so what if we are at point 2, illustrated in blue here? Aggregate expenditure is now less than our 45-degree line, it's less than total production, you're in an expansionary period because our planned expenditures are less than total production. We're not making enough to meet what the planned expenditure is. So since we're not making enough, inventory is flying off the shelves, we need to produce more. We're in an expansionary period to meet the demand. So essentially, we're in a constant state of moving back and forth between 1 and 2, right? We're trying to find that sweet spot where we're at planned expenditures equals total production. There aren't any unplanned changes in inventories, but we're constantly essentially moving between points 1 and 2, trying to find that right amount of inventories to have so that we're not having any unplanned increases or decreases in inventories. So we can see here, if we're at point 1, we're experiencing a decrease in unplanned inventories. And so the result is increasing production. Then if we're at point 2, we are seeing an unplanned increase in inventories, and the results eventually are decreases in production. Okay. So again, macroeconomic equilibrium can be anywhere on the 45-degree line. We want it ideally to be at potential GDP, which is the natural rate of unemployment or the full employment level. I'm not going to be talking too much about the multiplier effect. I just want you to understand that essentially this suggests that real GDP increases by more than a change in autonomous expenditures. The change in real GDP divided by the change in autonomous expenditures is the multiplier. And again, it's debated whether or not the multiplier effect is actually effective, whether or not there is an increase in real GDP when autonomous expenditures changes. So in theory, essentially, the multiplier effect states if the multiplier is 4, every $1 increase in planned investment eventually increases real GDP by $4. That's just in theory. It's just a number I came up with. It's a PFA number. And so there is a lot of debate on whether or not it actually works like that. So, one more thing I want to talk about related to the Keynesian cross is that it is related to the business cycle and the PPF curve. So at macroeconomic equilibrium, point 3 here, macroeconomic equilibrium, that is also at our neutral line within the business cycle here. So we can draw one down to there, an arrow down to there. So we're not in a recession or expansionary period here at the neutral line. We are in perfect macroeconomic equilibrium. That is also the institutional PPF curve. Remember, the PPF curve shows us the maximum attainable production. The institutional is about at 85% capacity. So macroeconomic equilibrium is at about 85% capacity if you're trying to translate it to the PPF curve. If you're in an expansionary period, that'd be anywhere beyond your institutional PPF curve. That would be if you are on your actual PPF curve, you're at the farthest most out expansionary period of production. And then anywhere less than the institutional PPF curve, that's when you are in a recessionary area. Planned expenditures are going to be greater than total production. So here is the multiplier effect I was talking about, process by which a change in autonomous expenditure leads to a larger change in GDP. It's debated. This is the formula for it. And then finally, we have our aggregate demand curve, a curve that shows the relationship between price level and planned AE in the economy. We'll be talking a lot about aggregate demand in Unit 3. This is just kind of an intro to aggregate demand. It is an inverse relationship between price level and real GDP. Therefore, it's going to look something like this. So that's going to be price level. And we're going to have real GDP. So what do you know? If it's an inverse relationship, we have a downward sloping demand curve. Okay. So, with that being said, that pretty much sums up chapter 12. I know that relating the Keynesian cross business cycle and PPF curve is complicated, but I hope that kind of gives you a greater overall picture of what's exactly going on when you are in a recessionary period, in an expansionary period, and understanding how unplanned changes in inventories affect where you are within the business cycle, on the PPF curve, and on the Keynesian cross. So it is important to understand that when there are unplanned changes in inventories, we do see changes in real GDP compared to real aggregate expenditure. Remember, aggregate expenditure is our planned expenditures, right? So if our planned expenditures are greater than our actual production, we need to move back towards macroeconomic equilibrium. We need to increase production to get back to 0.3, where AE equals our 45-degree line. If we are in an expansionary period where planned expenditures are less than total production, production's booming, everything's going great, we need to pull back and rein in production so we don't overheat the economy. And we'll be talking about this when we talk about monetary and fiscal policy a little bit. But that's why we're constantly going back and forth between points 1 and 2, trying to figure out where macroeconomic equilibrium, where's that perfect inventory amount at, and it's kind of one of those constantly moving, unattainable points. So we don't actually know exactly where we are, exactly where macroeconomic equilibrium is relative to where we're at. And so if I could predict when the next recession would be, then I wouldn't be here, right, teaching you. I would be probably on vacation on a beach somewhere, right? It's very difficult to actually predict when a recession is. And again, we'll be talking about this, but this is the kind of preview in understanding recession, expansion, macroeconomic equilibrium, business cycles, and the PPF curve. It kind of ties it all together. So if you have questions, comments, concerns about kind of what we covered in this chapter, feel free to let me know.